In this video, we'll review Chapter 34, which covers FDR and his struggle in the shadow of war. At the London Economic Conference of 1933, Roosevelt's early foreign policy was subordinated to his strategy for domestic economic recovery. The delegates hoped to coordinate an international attack on the global depression by stabilizing the values of currencies and the rate of exchange. Exchange rate stabilization was essential to the revival of the world trade. Roosevelt and the conference first thought of sending a delegation, including Secretary of State Cordell Hull, but then they had concerns about the conference's agenda, so they wanted to pursue inflationary policies at home to stimulate American recovery, but an international agreement to maintain the value of the dollar might tie FDR's hands, and he was concerned about that. So FDR was unwilling to sacrifice the possibility of domestic recovery for the sake of international cooperation. FDR scolded the conference for attempting to stabilize the currency, and he essentially declared America's withdrawal from the negotiations. The delegates adjourned empty-handed amid cries of American bad faith, but Roosevelt's attitude of every man for himself plunged the planet even deeper into economic crisis. The conference collapse strengthened the global trend towards extreme nationalism and made international cooperation even more difficult. It reflected the powerful persistence of American isolationism, which played into the hands of the dictators who were determined to shatter the world peace, and America would pay a very high price for trying to go it alone in the modern world. Freedom for and from the Filipinos and recognition for the Russians. These were both issues during this time period. So Roosevelt matched his isolation from Europe with withdrawal from Asia at the same time. The Great Depression had burst McKinley's imperialistic dream in the Far East. American taxpayers were eager to reject the expensive liability of the Philippine Islands. So they organized labor demanded the exclusion of the low-wage Filipino workers, and American sugar producers clamored for the elimination of the Philippine competition. So Congress passed the Tydings-McDuffie Act in 1934, which provided for independence of the Philippines after a 12-year period of economic and political tutelage, which was in 1946. The United States agreed to relinquish the army bases. The naval bases were reserved for future discussion and for retention. Americans were not so much giving freedom to the Philippines as freeing themselves from them. The Americans proposed to leave the Filipinos to their own fate, while imposing upon the Filipinos economic terms so ungenerous as to threaten their future economy. Once again, American isolationists rejoiced. Roosevelt made one internationalist gesture when he formally recognized the Soviet Union in 1933, and he extended diplomatic recognition despite the noisy protests of the anti-communist conservatives, and the Roman Catholics were offended by the Kremlin's anti-religious policies. FDR was motivated by trade with Soviet Russia, and he hoped to bolster Soviet Russia as a counterweight to Germany in Europe and Japan in Asia. FDR lands a big fish is the title of this political cartoon, which shows Roosevelt using the occasion of the Inter-American Conference for the maintenance of peace in Buenos Aires to embark on a good neighbor tour of South America. Roosevelt would like to become a good neighbor during this time period, and so he does just that. He inaugurated, refreshingly, a new era in relations with Latin America. He proclaimed in his inaugural address the policy of the good neighbor, which suggested that the United States was giving up its ambition to be a world power and would content itself with being a regional power. The interests and activities would be confined to the Western Hemisphere, and FDR was eager to line up Latin Americans to help defend the Western Hemisphere. FDR renounced armed intervention, especially the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And in 1933, at the 7th Pan-American Conferences, the U.S. delegation formally endorsed their policy of non-intervention. The Marines left Haiti in 1934 to demonstrate this, and after Batista came to power in Cuba, the Cubans were released from the Platt Amendment as well, under which the Americans had been free to intervene, and USA retained Guantanamo Bay Naval Base, though, even as a result of releasing them from the Platt Amendment. Panama received a similar uplift in 1936 when the United States relaxed its grip on the Isthmus nation. So the good neighbor policy was put into effect. This had an accent on consultation and non-intervention, and it received the acid test in Mexico, with the Mexican government seizing Yankee oil properties in 1934. American investors demanded armed intervention to repossess the confiscated businesses, but Roosevelt resisted badgering, and settlement was made in 1941 without intervention. The success of Roosevelt's good neighbor policy paid dividends in goodwill among Latin Americans. No other U.S. citizen has been held in such high regard as FDR in Latin America. The Colossus of the North now seemed less a vulture and more of an eagle. The chief architect, Secretary of State Hull, believed that trade was a two-way street. He believed that a nation can only sell abroad as it buys abroad, and that tariff barriers choke off foreign trade, and trade wars beget shooting wars. So he came up with the Reciprocal Trade Agreement Act in 1934, which was designed to lift U.S. export trade, which was hurt by the Depression. It was aimed at both relief and recovery, and it activated low tariff policies of the New Dealers. It avoided the dangers of the wholesale tariff revision. It whittled down the most objectionable schedules of the Holy Smoot Law by amending them. It empowered the president to lower the existing rate by as much as 50% in agreements with other countries willing to respond with similar reductions. Agreements were effective without the formal approval of the Senate, and this ensured a speedier action and sidestepping twin evils of high-stakes log rolling and high-pressure lobbying in Congress. Hull successfully negotiated the pacts with 21 countries by the end of 1939, and U.S. foreign trade increased appreciably. Trade agreements improved economic and political relations with Latin America and proved to be an influence for peace in the war-bent world. The Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act was a landmark piece of legislation. It reversed the high protective tariff policy that had existed unbroken since the Civil War, that had so damaged American and international economies following World War I. It also paved the way for American-led free trade international economic system that took shape after World War II. While the United States is focusing on isolationism, there was a spread of totalitarianism. Totalitarianism means the individual is nothing and the state is everything. The communist USSR led the way, with ruthless Joseph Stalin emerging as dictator. In 1936, he began to purge Russia of all suspected dissidents. He executed hundreds of thousands, and he banished millions to the remote Siberian forced labor camps. Benito Mussolini, a fascist, seized power in Italy during this time period as well in 1922. Adolf Hitler was a fanatic who plotted and harangued his way to the control of Germany as dictator in 1933. He was the most dangerous dictator because he combined tremendous power with impulsiveness. He secured control of the Nazi Party by making political capital of the Treaty of Versailles, and Germany's depression spawned unemployment. He withdrew Germany from the League of Nations in 1933 and began clandestinely and illegally rearming. In 1936, Hitler and Mussolini allied themselves in the Rome-Berlin axis. This is a picture called The Wages of Despair, showing disillusioned and desperate millions of Germans in the 1930s beginning to look to Adolf Hitler as their savior from the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which had ended World War I. This shows their hope that their Nazi leader, Hitler, would be their last hope. This shows Adolf Hitler reviewing the troops in Berlin in 1939. International gangsterism also spread in the Far East, while Americans continued to want to be isolationists. In Imperial Japan, like Germany and Italy, was a so-called have-not power, but they resented the ungenerous Treaty of Versailles as well and demanded additional space for its teeming millions that were cooped up in the crowded island nation. Japanese navalists were not to be denied, and they gave notice in 1934 of the termination of the 12-year-old Washington Naval Treaty. In 1935 in London, Japan torpedoed all hope of effective naval disarmament. When they denied with complete parity, they walked out of the multi-power conference. And or when they were denied complete parity, and they accelerated the construction of their giant battleships. In 1935, Japan quit the League of Nations, 2 years after Germany, and 5 years later they joined arms with Germany and Italy in the Tripartite Pact. Mussolini brutally attacked Ethiopia in 1935, and the brave defenders speedily were crushed. The League could have crushed Mussolini with the oil embargo, but they refused to do so. Isolationism in America was boosted by alarms from abroad. America believed the encircling sea gave her immunity, and she continued to suffer disillusionment from participation in World War I. They nursed bitter memories about debtors. Congress passed the Johnson Debt Default Act in 1934, which prevented debt-dodging nations from borrowing further from the United States. If they were attacked, delinquents could stew in their own juices. So mired down by the Great Depression, Americans had no real appreciation of the revolutionary forces being harnessed by the dictators. The have-not powers turned out to be the have powers. Americans had feared being drawn into totalitarian aggression, and they had called for a constitutional amendment to forbid a declaration of war by Congress, except in the case of invasion, unless there was favorable popular referendum. Princeton University students agitated in 1936 for a bonus to be paid for the veterans of future wars, while prospective frontliners were still alive. Congress is also, during this time period, going to try to legislate neutrality. Senator Gerald Nye of North Dakota was appointed in 1934 to investigate the blood business. Senatorial probers tended to shift blame away from the German submarines onto American bankers and arm manufacturers. Because they had made money, the illogical conclusion was that they had caused the war to make money. Congress made haste to legislate the nation out of the war. They passed the Neutrality Acts of 1935, 1936, and 1937. These stipulated that when the president proclaimed the existence of a foreign war, certain restrictions would automatically go into effect, and no American could legally sail on a belligerent ship. No American could sell or transport munitions to a belligerent nation, or could they make loans to a belligerent nation. The legislation abandoned the traditional policy of freedom of the seas. This political cartoon is called The Only Way We Can Save Her, 1939, and basically showing democracy here at the feet of Uncle Sam, showing America as its last refuge. Americans would continue to insist at this time on the morality of U.S. neutrality. America actually helped encourage aggressors along their blood-spattered path of conquest by declining to use the industrial strength to aid their democratic friends and defeat totalitarian foes. America dooms loyalist Spain. In the Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 1939, a painful lesson in folly of the neutrality by legislation was learned. General Francisco Franco was a fascist aided by fellow conspirators Hitler and Mussolini. Franco sought to topple the Republican loyalist regime. Loyalists got some assistance from the Soviet Union, and the American Roman Catholics were opposed to this loyalist regime. So the Abraham Lincoln Brigade was 3,000 men headed to Spain to fight as volunteers. They organized in an effort to basically help Spain. Washington continued official relations with the Loyalist government, but the existing neutrality legislation was changed to apply to arms embargoes to both the Loyalists and the rebels. Roosevelt did nothing while Franco abundantly was supplied by his fellow dictators. The democracies were so determined to stay out of war that they helped condemn their fellow democracy to death. In doing so, they encouraged the dictators towards further aggression. Such peace-at-any-priceism was cursed with illogic. America declined to build armed forces where it could deter the aggressors, and they allowed the Navy to decline in relative strength. So when Roosevelt repeatedly called for preparedness, he was branded a warmonger. Not until 1938 would Congress pass the billion-dollar Naval Construction Act. It was a calamitous story repeated. Too little, too late. In 1937, the United States tried to handle the aggressors by appeasing Germany and Japan. In 1937, the Japanese militarists touched off an explosion that led to an all-out invasion of China. Roosevelt declined to invoke neutrality laws by refusing to call the China incident an officially declared war. He did not want to cut off the trickle of munitions on which the Chinese depended, and while the Japanese could continue to buy war supplies in the United States as well. Roosevelt gives the quarantine speech in Chicago in the autumn of 1937. This calls for positive endeavors to quarantine the aggressors, presumably by economic embargoes. Isolationists feared a moral quarantine would lead to a shooting quarantine, and Roosevelt retreated and sought less direct means as a result to curb the dictators. America's isolationist mood intensified, and in December of 1937 the Japanese bombed and sank the American gunboat the Panay. 2 were killed and 30 were wounded, and Tokyo made necessary apologies and paid proper indemnities, and when they did that, Americans again breathed a sigh of relief. Hitler, though, grew louder and bolder in Europe, and he openly flouted the Treaty of Versailles by introducing compulsory military service in Germany. In 1935, he sent troops into the demilitarized German Rhineland. In March of 1938, Hitler bloodlessly occupied German-speaking Austria. Then he demanded German-inhabited Sudetenland of neighboring Czechoslovakia. Roosevelt's messages to both Hitler and Mussolini urged peaceful settlement, so a conference was held in Munich, Germany in September of 1938. The Western European democracies, badly prepared for war, betrayed Czechoslovakia to Germany by shearing off the Sudetenland. This was called the appeasement of the dictators. Basically, it was symbolized by the ugly word at Munich. This was surrender on an installment plan. And in March of 1939, scarcely 6 months later, Hitler erased the rest of Czechoslovakia from the map, contrary to his solemn woes, and the democratic world was stunned. They had really believed that by appeasing Hitler and giving him Sudetenland, that he would not move further into Czechoslovakia. Stalin, the Sphinx of the Kremlin, was the key to the peace puzzle. And on August 23, 1939, he astounded the world by signing the non-aggression treaty with the German dictator Hitler. This is the notorious Hitler-Stalin Pact, which gave Hitler the green light to make war with Poland and Western democracies, and Stalin plotted to turn Germany's accomplice against these Western democracies. With the signing of the pact, World War II was only hours away. Hitler demanded Poland return land she gained from Germany after World War I, and then Hitler attacked Poland in the Blitzkrieg on September 1, 1939. Britain and France, honoring their commitments to Poland, declared war, and at long last they perceived the folly of the continued appeasement policy, but they were powerless to aid Poland. So World War II was now fully launched, and a long truce of 1919 to 1939 was at an end. This is a political cartoon titled Poland Falls to the Nazi Juggernaut 1939, showing that Hitler, after swallowing Austria and Czechoslovakia, launched an all-out war on Poland with the Blitzkrieg in September 1939. Roosevelt issued the routine proclamation of neutrality as a response. Americans overwhelmingly were anti-Nazi and anti-Hitler, but they fervently hoped the democracies would win and fondly believed that the forces of righteousness would triumph, as in 1918, but they were determined to stay out of the war and were not to be suckers again. So the neutrality promptly became a heated issue in the United States. Britain and France urgently needed American planes and weapons, and the Neutrality Act of 1937 had raised its forbidding hand, because now these were belligerent countries to which the United States could not sell arms and munitions. So the Neutrality Act of 1939 was passed, saying that European democracies might buy U.S. war materials, but only on a cash-and-carry basis. They would have to transport the munitions in their own ships after paying for them in cash. America would avoid loans, war debts, and torpedoing of American arms carriers, and Roosevelt authorized to proclaim the danger zones into which U.S. merchant ships were forbidden to enter. The unneutral neutrality law hurt China, which was effectively blockaded by Imperial Japanese Navy. It clearly favored the European democracies against the dictators, so it wasn't really so neutral. The United States not only improved its moral position, but also helped its own economic position as a result. And the overseas demand for war goods brought about a sharp upswing from the recession of 1937 to 1938. Ultimately, this production of war armaments solved the decade-long unemployment crisis.